So by now you know the drill. We'll have a Q&A session and we'll have the mic passed around. I think we will also ask for you still to keep your questions brief and on topic. Just please give me a signal. Okay, so when you're thinking about it a bit, I can start with my question on myself then. What is interesting in all the academic topics, but I think especially interesting when we're discussing informal politics is, of course, the issue of methodology. So my question to you both concern how do you find information, how do you verify this information, what are your sources when you're in this project or in earlier projects approach these murky aspects of politics. Do you still drink with Russian criminals, Mark?
Interestingly, that happens much less these days. One is because I am sort of less young and therefore less stupid than I was. But also interestingly because I think actually talking to a Westerner has just generally become a bit more toxic, a bit more dangerous an experience since 2014. I mean, less so for people who are on the underworldy side than on the state side, but interestingly, there is a similar trajectory. I mean, these days, I find I lose more contacts than I make, in the sense of people who once upon a time would have been willing to talk to me are now much less likely to do so. So it happens much less. I mean, on this particular topic, I mean, one of the great virtues is because we're talking about essentially Russian operations in the West, and above all in Europe, that actually that is where a lot of the real material is. We have court cases, and court cases are brilliant because all of a sudden it means huge amounts of documents come into public view. We also have the fact that this is an issue about which both law enforcement and also security agencies are, to an extent, willing to talk. But the final point I make is, and again, I mean, it says something about Russia and about, I think, the contrast between many people's perceptions of Russia, is actually the extent to which there is striking levels of internal discussion. And sometimes you find it on weird and wonderful, or not so weird, or not so wonderful Telegram channels. Sometimes you find it on certain sort of websites and things. I mean, there are extraordinary Crime Russia and Prime Crime websites, which are more or less like, if you imagine sports fanatics, but instead of sports teams and individuals, they follow gangsters and gangs. But there's huge amounts of discussion, and again, a lot of it is nonsense and speculation, but there's actually a lot in there, which is why it's worth mentioning Europol follow these. So, I mean, actually, the funny thing is there is a lot of knowledge. The problem, the real problem is the triangulation, is you get that one great rumor, and you think, wow, I want that to be true. And finding other ways to actually be sure that, well, hopefully be sure that it is true, rather than just simply it's just not a really great rumor.
Okay, yeah, how do you go about opening a new field of research interest?
Yeah, well, in this line of research, I rely on open sources, media, also to a certain extent, the Telegram channels that often you find pieces of information that you want to be true, and that would really fit well in my thesis and everything, but you have to thread very carefully. I don't have or any like these several years of experience talking to such
the most polite
actors.
way of calling me old, I've heard. Yeah.
Yeah, right. But there's a striking amount of information out there. It's not a problem of lack of information. It's the abundance of information and conflicting information, and probably information that's not very neither easy to triangulate nor easy to to check that particular piece of information. So one source claims that Prigozhin is governed or a tool of the Kremlin. Another source claims that he's just out making money. You can't place the truth in the exact middle between those either. So it's meticulous work, and but there's a lot of information available of different credibilities.
Okay, thank you. We have a question up there, or yeah, and one down here. We'll take both.
Thank you very much for two very interesting presentations. My name is Karen Aneigen. I'm a research fellow at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. I have three questions. First two ones are for you, Mark. One, when will you start your own podcast? Because I'm sure I'm not the only one who missed the times when you spoke on the power of vertical. The second question is if you could elaborate a bit on the intelligence services use of organized crime, and if you could say it's a means or a method to disrupt in Europe, for instance. And the third question is, would you call, as you mentioned, Gjerda, the Wagner Group, would you also categorize that as organized crime? Thank you.
Then we have Kristin Wendersgaard.
Thank you very much. My name is Kristin Brusgaard. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oslo. Thank you for very interesting talks. I was thinking about one concept that neither of you mentioned, but that I think probably infuses both your comments, which is deniability and the importance of deniability with regard to the Russian calculations about making use of informal actors rather than other actors or resources that are more closely associated with the Russian state. So I wondered if you would both like to comment on the issue of deniability and what the implications are with regard to this concept as it pertains to how we should be dealing with Russian policies that, for example, take place in our societies. What are the repercussions in terms of whether we should be holding Russia accountable for these activities? Thank you.
Okay, podcast. At the moment someone pays me to do it. Is the glib answer of a freelancer. No, it's something I might do at some point, but I keep meaning to. Who knows? In terms of the intelligence services use of organized crime, though, I mean, I think it's not, I think, specifically as a sort of means of disruption. It's essentially as operational support. I mean, the big picture, in my opinion, is, what is Russia's kind of strategy? Well, there is no such thing. Its approach to the West is, look, ideally it wants the West to give it what it wants, which is to recognize it as a great power, and that means, because I think Putin has a very 19th century notion of what a great power is, it means sphere of influence, it means like Ukraine, it means a voice in every single sort of major international issue, and it means a sort of basically the get-out-of-jail-free card from international law from time to time. All things that, as far as he's concerned, America has got. Now, given that we're not willing to do that, I think the option is therefore to divide us, to distract us, and to demoralize us, precisely so that we're not in a position to be coherently able to resist Russia when it actually does seek to sort of assert its own interests. Now, this is much, much wider than any one particular instrument. I mean, this is the whole point. It's everything from the trolls to overt foreign policy initiatives to intelligence activities and such like. Organized crime, I think, fills a very small niche, you might say, of supporting those activities. And as I said, I think the most important one they do these days is exactly in terms of generating funds. Because that fund, I mean, you know, if you want to, I mean, I don't believe for a minute that the Russians had a crucial role in electing Trump, or even much I would love to be able to blame Putin for it, past getting the Brexit referendum sort of through. It would be so nice not to have to blame ourselves. But, you know, that would have cost millions and been really obvious. On the other hand, someone who runs some populist website, particularly pushing certain kind of divisive agenda from the bedroom in their mum's house, 10,000 euros can probably keep them sort of doing it for a whole year because it's a sort of, you know, a passion or something for them. Small amounts of money, if they can be, but the point is, you know, from the Russian point of view, the problem's always been, how do you actually transfer that money without making it really obvious? This is a way of generating that. So in a way, you can have certain sources. Certainly when I was in Prague, for example, you know, there are a couple of news outlets there that genuinely their funding streams seem very, very questionable and opaque, and their messaging does seem very, very convenient for the Russians. But we are stuck with actually having to rely on what we can prove, because that's the nature of modern law-based democratic societies. Which in a way leads me on to the whole business of deniability. I mean, Yadadar actually, as part of this project, has elaborated a very interesting paper, so I'll let him talk about sort of his aspect. But I mean, my view is that, yes, Russia often enjoys deniability. For some reason, we actually have made quite a fetish of it, in the sense of we almost feel that we need to apply juridical standards to be able to say that people, you know, we think that they did X, that we can prove it in a court of law. Well, it's not the case. You know, Pearl Harbor, no one was sitting there thinking, well, they look like Japanese planes, but can we be sure they really were? Now, after a certain point, Occam's razor has to apply. But the interesting thing about deniability is actually a lot of Russia's adventurous activities, if I can euphemize them as that, are designed to be deniable, but only up to a point. Skripal case, for me, is the best example. Look, if you just wanted to kill this ex-spy who you think is still in the game, which is my reason, you know, my opinion as to why they wanted to kill him, because they thought, in a way, he was breaking the terms of his pardon. There are much easier, cheaper, and more subtle ways. You just push him under a bus. You shoot him in what seems to be an apparent robbery, whatever. You use Novichok, weapons-grade Novichok, in other words, stuff that came recently out of a factory, not something that was made in someone's, you know, basement or shed. Because you want to be able to say, it's nothing to do with us, but with a nod, a wink, and a sly little twinkle that says, of course it was us, but you can't prove it. A lot of what Russia wants to do in this context, in my opinion, is precisely to create the sense that Russia is too dangerous, too unpredictable, too erratic, too problematic in general, and that therefore we need to strike a deal. That is, you know, it's a kind of an upgraded version of Nixon's, you know, lunatic school of foreign policy.
Yeah, I totally agree. I just on the Wagner Group, organized crime. Well, private military companies happen to be illegal in Russia. So in that sense, it's we're talking about crime, but in the more conventional sense, it's hard to talk about Wagner as organized crime. It was important, I think, when we discuss these issues, is not to get locked to certain concepts and impose them on reality. It's also with this deniability. I totally agree. I think maybe running the risk of becoming too philosophical here, that we are becoming too, so to speak, Protestant in a way. If I will go back to what I did my PhD thesis on, it was on political myths. And if you go back in the history of ideas, you will see that the Greeks accepted different levels of reality. They developed science. The ancient Greeks, of course, developed science, but at the same time they had this flourishing mythology that they sort of believed in, sort of didn't believe in, but it carried a significance in their lives. And this also goes sort of hand in hand with post-modernism. Russia, or Moscow, is in many ways the capital of postmodernism. They like narratives, they like spectacles, and it's great. Like the Skripal case, you can put on a huge spectacle, send a signal, while at the same time officially deny it, that you are behind it. So that's makes it a valuable tool. But if we're preoccupied with, of course, you can prove or disprove who did it or didn't do it, but sometimes it's only an empty shell, but it's still there. What's important is the signal they're trying to send.
Okay, thank you. Some more questions from the audience? Plenty, that's good. Okay, Gro Holm first, and we got another one here.
Yes, I'm Gro Holm from Norwegian Broadcasting. I was wondering a question about measurement. How important is groups like the Wagner Group in the Russian Africa policy? Because you don't get a sense from what you are talking about. You get a sense it's in a way impressive, but how essential is it to Russia's strategy in Africa, and also, for instance, in Syria, where they were active? And about this black Chornaya Kasa, yeah, I was wondering, at what level are the decisions taken? Who will take the decision how to spend the money, or to create a Chornaya Kasa from a particular criminal group, or to put them, to make them operatives for FSB, for instance? At what level would that be decided? And also, how important are these Chornaya Kasa for the Russian goals and aims, and for the Russian operatives on the state level in foreign countries?
We'll have another question here, right away.
Yeah, my name is Natalia Irmieva. I'm currently affiliated with the Oslo Metropolitan University. Thanks so much for a fantastic session, and I have a question to Mark Alotti. Just going through the list of your recent publications, I just get an impression of rather strong interest in Russian-Ukrainian relationships, and that's why I was wondering if you could elaborate briefly on the role of Russian organized crime in the so-called separatist republics in the eastern Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll stick to these questions now, and I will have a final round if you've got time.
Yeah, whether Wagner is essential to Russia in Africa? Well, essential. I would say it's, in my perspective, where it's important to show Russia, or it's important for Russia to appear as an alternative, as an alternative, a new vector in the multipolar world order. Russia to appear as a great power, while at the same time not having economic or even at least conventional military resources comparable to that of say the US, that has more and more withdrawn from the continent, but still, and China, who has invested immense amounts of money. So it goes often this informal non-state element often goes hand in hand with the official initiatives, but it can go further, it can fill other tasks. It's a way of achieving things to a relatively moderate price, I would say. Yeah.
In terms of the sort of decision making and how important gangster activity is, well, look, first of all, in terms of the importance, not very much at the moment. As I said, it's, you know, I think it's a noteworthy phenomenon, but it's not in any way a major one. However, one of the interesting points we always have to remember is the risks of unintended consequences. At the moment, there is a sort of great effort going into identifying where Russian sort of oligarchs and minigarchs spend their money, and, as it were, the formal flows of money. Well, the more effective we are at, identifying and locating and tracking that, and therefore making it less able to be used for political purposes, actually we create an incentive for them just simply to shift to criminal money instead. Because it's either that or they just stop spending money at all in their operational uses. Where's the decision-making coming from? That's a really interesting point, and I think it speaks to, for me, one of the most fundamental issues about understanding how the Putin system works, which is actually, for me, again, we've had this term adhocracy. I mean, so much of what happens is generated from below. Putin is not this chess grandmaster who's sitting there making all the decisions and planning things umpteen steps in advance. So much of this is generated from below, from within the system. It either never gets approval at all, except within its own sort of structures, or it only sort of becomes worthy of being okayed once it's reached a certain stage and has been proven to be successful, and they're trying to say, hey, we'd like to be rewarded for this. This is actually a very, very decentralized system. So actually, I would suggest that probably what it is you have tasking that goes with intelligence agencies, FSB, Foreign Intelligence Service, GRU, and so forth. And if one of them decides, okay, well, as part of our tasking, we want to increase the amount of, just to pick an example, at random, post-Brexit secessionism within Scotland. So, okay, we want to try and encourage more talk about Scottish independence. We want to sort of make the tone of discussion more toxic than it might otherwise be, and so forth. And most of the time they're thinking, okay, well, what can be done through RT, or what can be done through disinformation or troll farms or whatever. But they might think, okay, well, we've identified a specific again, a political group or similar that we'd like to find some way of supporting. And then they'd be thinking, okay, well, how can we do that? Now, if they have alternative means, they will do so by alternative means. If they suddenly think, though, no, we still need some money, then maybe they'll think, okay, well, who do we know? Which gangs do we know that are operating that we can squeeze for money? So it's not actually that it sits there then thinking, we will now co-opt organized crime. It's from time to time they need things doing, and they will just look at whatever instruments are at their disposal, and sometimes organized crime will be the indicated one. But again, it's a utilitarian, quite imaginative, dispersed, diffused way of generating activity. And in terms of going on to Russia and Ukraine, I mean, in a way, the separatist pseudo-states have acquired, to an extent, their own momentum, and their armed forces, however ramshackle, indisciplined, and criminalized they are, have sort of become that. But if one looks at the genesis of many of the militia units, it's clear that there were some which are basically near enough organized crime gangs, localized organized crime gangs, that found an opportunity to, in some ways, convert the will and the capacity to use violence into political and economic power. And we still see that to this day. I mean, some of the skirmishes of the ceasefire violations do not in any way appear to have been sort of instructed from Lugansk or Donetsk or Moscow or whatever, they're actually just started, they happen brush fire style, they happen there. And one of the reasons, sometimes it's just because someone thinks there's something wrong or whatever, but one of the reasons why that happens is it's a classic tactic. That you say that the Ukrainians, and frankly it also works on the other side of the border, but primarily on this side, you say that Ukrainians tried to launch an attack, and you burnt off 20,000 rounds of ammunition doing so. You actually shot 10,000 rounds. Within a week, you'll get 20,000 new rounds, having been funneled from these sort of depots outside Rostov-on-Don and such like. And you will sell the excess 10,000. You will monetize the war for your own advantage. So there is a lot of, in a way, institutionalized criminality that is now taking place within that war. But the interesting final point I'd make is I once had a conversation with an officer from the SBU, the Ukrainian intelligence service. We know that there's huge amounts of smuggling flows that certainly used to take place through the Donbass region, particularly heroin, part of the northern route of heroin from Afghanistan. So I said to him, look, of course routes change, but in aggregate terms, has the start of the conflict in any way changed the flow of drugs? And he said, not at all. Ukrainian gangs and Russian gangs, their countries may be at undeclared war, but they are the true internationalists. They are still perfectly comfortable talking, working, making deals and making money with each other, even while notionally the fighting goes on.
Thank you. I believe we have Ina Sangarcheva, please. Anyone else? Please give me a sign.
Thank you very much both for interesting stories about Russia. But I want to ask Mark, also my question also again about society. If we go back to, if I understand correctly, if you should correct me if I'm wrong, but in the Soviet time, there was kind of different approach to KGB. It has a role and so on. And today it's different. And society accepted, in a way, this kind of structure. How it plays now in terms of what you have been researching? Do you see the change in society? Is it supporting, do they support this kind of, I do believe that the society at large accept that things are going on, they are in elites, they are just, conflicting with each other. But how is it now? Do you have any data, how the society as such, and do you see the emergence of the rule of law in a way? There is a kind of an interest to systemize, to know what is going on, and what is your perception for transformation of these kind of groups? How do you see in the nearest future? Thank you.
Thank you. This is the last chance of getting additional questions from the audience. Okay, I'd just like to add one question myself then before you answer, and also add your final comments. I wonder, or I want to go back to the elite dynamics and where we started today. We heard that many mayors, governors, others subjected to these purges are also subjected to criminal trials. And we also know that not only in this wave, but also in the previous wave, we have had an influx of technocrats, so-called, or managers, or men with square glasses. So my question is whether we can see in this development an element of anti-corruption, of an attempt to decriminalize at least part of the government structure.
Okay, so we end on the all of society and everything in 10 minutes or whatever.
We have about 5 minutes, actually.
Okay, very briefly. It's worth mentioning about transformation of groups. The current, in my opinion, the current status quo within the underworld is actually relatively brittle. It's under pressure. 1990s, you had this, decade of turf wars, which led to an understanding of, it led to the drawing of boundaries and pecking orders and so forth. The Putin social contract in many ways fossilized that. And that was a good thing because it reduced the amount of violence. But on the other hand, bizarrely enough, the problem is not enough gangsters are getting killed. By which I mean that actually you haven't got social mobility, and therefore there is a generation of sort of 40-somethings gangsters who are watching their 60-somethings godfathers showing no sign of retiring. Does this sound familiar? There are interesting kind of parallels between presidencies in certain systems and godfatherdoms. But, and the 40-somethings are thinking, well, when is my chance? And we've already seen that lead to certain sort of episodes of violence. Certainly, I think, were there an explosion, a serious explosion of conflicts within the underworld, I think that would very much change the whole political equation. At the moment, you might say this both social and governmental tolerance for kind of organized crime is predicated on the fact that it does not lead to real threats for ordinary people. Nowadays, when someone gets gunned down in a mob hit, basically it's always someone who's in that world anywhere, and no one cares. It gets you 2 column inches on page 6 of the Omsk Courier, and you move on. No one feels at risk the way they did in the 1990s. It doesn't mean to say that I think everyone's fine with the situation. It's just that it's just not a particularly visible one. It's not like corruption. Everyone has their own corruption stories. It doesn't matter if you're a bus driver or a professor. You experience that in a way that most people do not experience organized crime. So, I think that it's in some ways it's a pending issue rather than anything else. Rule of law, I put my faith in pragmatic kleptocrats. Rule of law will probably not bubble up from the bottom, it will come from the top. It's exactly the people who currently have spent the last decade stealing with both hands and say, well, okay, I've stolen enough now, I'd like that to be legitimate. People who stole in the 1990s, who are thinking about succession themselves. Again, we continue to come back to the same themes. Who want to be able to hand it to their kids or whoever, but in a way that is legitimate and fixed. This is unfortunately where rule of law comes from. It comes from the interests of the wealthy. And that's why one of the reasons why I'm kind of unfashionably optimistic about Russia. And so linking that finally to this business of the sort of purge of the elites and things. Yeah, I think that, again, organized crime does not really feature in much of this. Corruption and embezzlement is different. If one looks at something like, for example, the Sochi Winter Olympics, in which organized crime clearly was involved in various, making money out of everything from property deals to bring in traffic laborers to build facilities beforehand, that kind of thing. The big contracts go to the big players. And it's subcontracts and subcontracts and somewhere in the chain of subcontracting, firms that are basically linked to organized crime come into it. But it's not as though the Rothenberg brothers or whoever who get the contracts then sit down with godfathers of organized crime to make deals. It happens organically in the process. Obviously, as you get to local politics, things get that much more close. The chains are much smaller when you're a mayor of some small town or something like that. But I think there is a certain awareness that organized crime is not just politically toxic, but also economically counterproductive in many ways. When one saw anything like a real fight back against organized crime in Italy, it required 3 things. Proper laws on the books that actually will allow the state to do it, law enforcement structures willing and able to do the job, and a political elite that was forced by public opinion to unleash the law enforcers to use the laws. Now, Russia actually, it has the right laws, in the main. There are problems, but it has them there. It actually has a law enforcement community which, in my opinion, there is a large number of people who do want to do the job. The problem is the mechanisms of how you actually get the elite to unleash them. In the absence of working democracy, it's going to have to come from the self-interest of the elite to do that.
Thank you. I think we need to give the last couple of minutes to Jardar.
Just to add, fully agree again, but I think we will can see that there is a recognition in the elite that things ideally would have to change. It's just by ad hoc ways it happens to work in other ways that than perhaps intended. So this is always tempting to quote former Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin in this case, that we wanted it to be better, but it came out as usual. So
yeah, that is always a good way to end the seminar.
pessimistic.
So please join me in giving them a big hand.